Hi, good morning. This is a class that got inspiration from a book that I read a while back about the history of global trade and the spread of religion, which followed the trade. Now, it's my most difficult task is to coming up with a title, and I just picked it on the whim, and perhaps it's not as familiar to many people as I thought it might be. Uh, Maybe I should have named it Krishna to Buddha to Christ to Muhammad, because religion uh, is uh, is of interest to a lot of senior citizens. But this is not exclusively about the religion, so it would not have told all the stories. And the other title that I came across was Wet Silk Road. That may be a bit risque, but there is a segue into it, which I shall get into it in just a minute. Okay, name Indus may not be familiar to all of you, and it's was introduced by the Greeks who had difficulty in pronouncing the name of the river, which is in native languages of India and in Sanskrit was named Sindhu, Sindhu. Why? But we'll get into the linguistic controversies and history as we go along. Okay. Now, this little sculpture that is there, shows a king who is riding in a chariot, and obviously it's very ancient. This is a name that I'm sure most of you are not familiar with. It's a King Ashoka who lived and ruled northern India and almost, from all the way from Afghanistan to southern India for the first major empire that the Indian subcontinent had seen a long time ago. And his name is a misnomer. Ashoka in Sanskrit means absence of remorse. But he was, you know, uh, plagued with remorse all his life, and which led to his conversion to Buddhism and spread. But that's a long chapter, probably for next day. Okay, now here's I mentioned silk and trade, and the major part of our talk will involve trade between Rome and India, and before uh, China has popularized Silk Road, which is a relatively new finding in the length of history. It started mostly around 700 or 800 current era, with the Mongol conquest of Central Asia. But the original sea trade was going on for more than 5,000 years before, as we'll get into it when we talk about Indus Valley civilization. Now, some of the Roman who is who lamented the silk trade. Seneca the elder, you know, uh, wrote a statement: "Silk fails as clothing because it really does not cover and is not modest enough." On the other hand, Pliny the Elder, the well-known historian, he was more worried about the economic consequences of the trade deficit, while Tacitus, he was lamenting the moral decay and was successful in passing a Senate law in banning men from wearing silk. And not to be outdone, this went all the way to the emperor, who obviously had plenty of money at his disposal. But according to later sources, he refused to allow his wife to purchase purple silk, citing its exorbitant cost. So the concern regarding trade balance and global trade has long roots. Now, this silk is traditionally associated with China, saying the Chinese introduced, and that's correct to majority of extent. But while researching this subject, I came across that even the Indus Valley civilization had was familiar with silk. There was wild silk cocoons that were raised, and meticulously they were able to untangle from natives' wild silkworms. There are various botanical names for it. The mulberry silkworm, which is somewhat different than the one that was used in or grown, cultivated in China. And this was a regional product. So silk evolved independently in two different major cultures. Okay, moving on to this is the traditional mention of Silk Road, which, as you can see, that it cleverly avoids touching India and it touches the port in somewhere in modern day Pakistan. Okay, and that may be more to do with the Chinese political sensibilities. And the Silk Road just goes straight across from. Now, it turns out that ancient Rome or Greece and China were very vaguely aware of itself because the middle end area there were multiple small kingdoms, various tribes, who were pirates and attacking. So that was really a much more later arrival. Okay, but the sea truth, as with the big Indian Ocean, the India was the center of the trade between uh, Mediterranean, Africa, Arabia, and Southeast Asia, and around the coast of Southeast Asia, China. So it played a central figure. So it has a lot to do with the climate because the climate was a lot more suitable, and it has favorable coastlines as opposed to Atlantic and Pacific. Pacific is vast and is covered with varieties of islands. And on the other hand, traveling north-south, the Atlantic the weather had a lot to do with it. Okay, and the name Silk Road is a relatively new invention that the term was introduced in around 18th century by a European traveler named Oral Stein, who came up with the term Silk Road. So it's a relatively new idea. And obviously, the Chinese had come up with the Belt Initiative and the Arctic Initiative, but that's not the subject of our talk here. Okay, now, obviously, along with silk was luxury item, but constituted only a small portion of the trade because it was only the rich who could afford it. But the most essential necessities were spices, and obviously the who is who or the royalties were more associated in gold for balance of payment. Now, this is a hypothetical question. Where is the biggest private hoard in the world? Okay, hint, it is not in Mar-Lago, no, although the owners of the estate would love it to be so, but it's in the Indian private hands. The Indian women will give up anything except for their own gold treasures. So this has a long-standing history, and there were actually gold mines in southern India along with diamond mines. So the subcontinent has a long history of rich minerals deposits. So the trade was mostly about gold, copper, and spices. In fact, the lowest soldier, came across observation that a Roman soldier at Hadrian Wall, had a little packet of pepper just to, survive the miserable cold of England and the British diet. At the same time, pepper shows up in the Egyptian pharaohs' tombs. The great Ramses' nose showed pepper on both sides. And at the same, and not to be outdone, Attila the Hun, who put an end to the Roman Empire, had asked for gold and spices. And the tradition continued that when Vasco da Gama appeared on the coast of India, we came looking for gold, spices, and Christians. Okay, so this was has a long traditional history of trade and religion. Okay, and obviously Columbus was also in search for India, as you all very well know. Okay, now trade and globalization, that's the subject matter. Okay, and now when I was in Wisconsin, one of the local part of University of Wisconsin at Oshkosh had come up with a clever acronym called Indus, which was the India and US collaboration, was a cultural exchange thing. Now, just to compare, both the major countries of Southeast Asia, are influenced by the weather, and there are clear differences between the two, which need to be stated here. That India has united based on religion, i.e., Hinduism, which came in from with the arrival of the Aryans from the steppe region of Central Asia, while China is more related by socio-political and the Confucian tradition. And this should be reversed. China is a lot more homogeneous. Majority of population is Han Chinese and speak the same language, while India has at least official 29 languages. And Indians are notorious in not writing down anything. And that's the verbal tradition of Vedas, the one that is spoken, so which we'll talk about in the next few slides. And on the other hand, China has been plagued by varieties of floods. The floods of Yangtze and the Yellow River are well known throughout history. While India has been fortunate, has had more irrigation, and the rivers are more manageable, and therefore even though India's area is far smaller than the United States, there is a large amount of arable lands. Okay, but the Indian weather is dramatically influenced by a monsoon, because there is almost people would hold prayer meetings if the monsoon is late, and the monsoon has affected growth of civilization. Not because, as you can very well imagine, most of the civilization grew around the river basins and where the weather was favorable. Okay, including Euphrates Tigris, Nile River, the Indus River, and at the same time Yellow River. So all the major civilization has evolved around rivers. Okay, and okay, so these are the main differences. Now, as you very well know, the humans, Homo sapiens, evolved in Africa and left the bridge between Arabia and started walking, and in 60, 70,000 years had made all the way to Australia, the Homo sapiens. Now, at the same time, there were some, all of you are quite familiar with the famous caves in France, where it showed the early evidence of habitation dating back to 40 to 60,000 years ago. But these have been discovered even in Central Asia. The rock art you can see from this little graffiti that's written on the wall of hunter-gatherers, in India, that dates back to Paleolithic times. So human habitation has been in subcontinent for thousands of years, and at the same time, some of their descendants are quote unquote aborigines are still present and are considered tribals. And a small island in the Bay of Bengal is still habited in both the British government during the Empire days, and later Indian government has wisely left them alone because they can be fierce fighters for their territory preservation. Okay, and just most of you studied Mesopotamian civilization as the cradle of civilization in high school. So this is just a refresher that the earliest quote unquote civilization that started with the rise of farming with the Sumerian, followed by Akkadian, that split into two, the Babylonian and Assyrian. So these were the main civilization that started from around 8,000 before the current era to around 500 when the Persian Empire conquered most of the Middle East, extending all the way to Egypt. Now the Egyptian Empire is outside this of Mesopotamia and was concurrent. And at the same time, there were other civilizations that were developing in the eastern half of the known world, which would be India as well as China. So there were four parallel civilizations that along slightly north of the equator, and around in the Nile's Delta region, the Mesopotamia, India, as well as China. And this just puts, in the proper time sequence. I'll have it in the next slide. So you can just see that, the earliest civilization I enlisted, and those are well familiar with most of you with the cuneiform tablets and the Epic of Gilgamesh and Ashurbanipal, but that's outside our subject matter for today. Okay, and these are some beautiful maps that just I came across a few days ago. So you can just see that the ancient and the Near Middle East, Assyria, was one of the earliest kingdoms. Okay, and followed by Elamite civilization. Okay, now I couldn't find the first maps of earlier type thing, but this is a good starting point, as good as any. followed by the other civilizations which followed in this region, which you can see the Hittite kingdom, the Babylonians, and the other Elamite kingdoms, that followed on their tail. Okay, so there were a lot of small kingdoms, that just fought for, and and they were great builders. They built big palaces, and had were always constantly fighting each other. Okay, and this is again further down a couple of hundred years later. You can just see that the Hittites split up into varieties of other smaller kingdoms, and the rise of Babylon that took place. And again, in between, there was a Mitanni kingdom, that was replaced and taken over by Persians. Okay, and the Persians were not Semitic people. They came from Central Asia, so will be a big subject when we talked about the rise of Indo-Europeans, which came out and literally populated almost a majority of Europe, as well as had a huge influence in modern Persia or Iran, as well as northern India. And now, getting back to the subject matter, which is Indus Valley civilization that flourished from circa 3300 before the current era to about 1300 before the current era. And you can just see from this particular map that it comprised of a large area from the foothills of Himalayas. You can see from the top to extending up to the border of modern day Iran and what is now Pakistan, as well as to the deserts in northern India. And you can see that there are a huge number of rivers, i.e. seven. That is why in the classic Indian literature, so-called Vedic literature, it is called a land of seven rivers. And I think I'm not going to label all of them because the names would be rather alien to you, but you can just see that the Indus is the main one that runs centrally and ends up in the Arabian Sea down here. And now the discovery of this civilization was accidental, to put it mildly, when the British Empire was building a railroad from India to Lahore. They saw this huge mound, which was an easy source for bricks, and the locals called it the Mound of the Dead, and that's how it's translated as Mohenjo-daro. And this was the earliest findings. You can just see right here, this big arrow that you put down. So that is where. And then the British Archaeological Society started doing the excavation there and found out that this was a remnant of an old civilization. They found brick walls extending several feet below the ground, and the excavation was continued. And later on, they came up with varieties of other findings, which include, a granary and a huge public bath. And so that was the start of what later came to be known as Indus Valley civilization. Later, other findings were discovered in a place which is somewhere substantially north from the Arabian Sea. It's a few hundred miles from this area, extending the whole north-south length of modern-day Pakistan. And it's a place called Harappa, and that has been excavated for last 75 years, from 1940 onwards until present day, when various scholars have made it their lifelong passion and subject of studies, including French, Americans, British, Indians, Pakistanis, and so on and so forth. Now, obviously, this civilization had easy access to the coast. You can see that they were almost adjacent to Mesopotamia, and this is well evidenced by a place which is the third arrow, which was in the wrong place, or called Lothal, Lothal, where they found docks with a good drainage system that I'll get to in a little minute. Now, this Neolithic civilization, which continued into Bronze civilization, had, trade network, not just across the land, but across the sea as well, to ports on the Arabian side. The small island, which was known at that time as Dilmun, which the name has now changed to a place called Bahrain. And at the same time, there were other trading places along with, that's how the small goods were transferred the coast, or staying, hugging more close to the coast. And at the same time, the Red Sea, which does not show up on this map, was also an equally good trade route to all the way to Egypt, along initially by Red Sea, and then later on, by land to the Nile Delta. Okay, so this is, so it's covered a huge area of several thousand miles, and it was heavily populated as well for considering the time when it evolved. And primarily, these were it was a transition from hunter-gatherers, which were the earliest inhabitants, to farming. And the farming technology may have evolved independently or may have been imported from Mesopotamia, but that is a matter of conjuncture. But at the same time, with farming came some type of a central authority that the occupations were assigned, and the people's needs increased. So that involved the rise of trade and craftsmen. And the craftsmen, were and were participating in varieties of pottery, which was available with mud, and the stone was in relatively less supply. And the potters, where the skill gradually evolved. Along with that, they had access to the sea, so they were able to get seashells and make ornaments. And now, the trade always required some type of accounting system, so that led to the rise of writing, and evidenced by a pictographic script that has yet not been deciphered. And when people had access to shells, obviously the personal appearance took place, and that led to the invention of varieties of ornaments, okay, bangles that have been discovered. And depending upon, now, initially one can say that all this just came from Middle East, but the scholars have determined that some of the shells are only available in this particular region, establishing that they were independently evolved and they had their own code, likes and dislikes for, and skills that they had acquired. And so these are varieties of things. So we talked about, the Uruk civilization, the cylinders, as well as the seals, which were kept for record keeping. And let's just show you this in the Harappan mound. And there are varieties of graffitis that the potters had left. And then here we had along with that, the belief system had evolved as to some type of because they were dependent upon monsoon, so that led to the rise of some type of a religious belief. We're not quite sure as to what exactly their beliefs were, but varieties of symbols, including the famous or infamous swastika, is apparent in their pottery marking, which we'll more on it a little later. Okay. Okay, and the earliest civilization, along with families, they had discovered the wheel, and at the same time, you can just see the smaller toys were made for children, and so this is well apparent that they had the art of making a hole inside the shell that required some type of refining technology, and so that is well discovered. And there you can see from this mic that there are varieties of marks to do some type of accounting. Okay, moving on. And then again, this was not just mud, and some of the rich people had ornaments from silver and gold. Okay, and depending upon this are some of the more evidence of bangles, that the poor people wore larger bangles, while the rich people had the smaller, sophisticated, finely crafted jewelry items. Okay, and along with this, there were other items which were involved in trade, which is turquoise and the famous precious stone coming from Afghanistan called lapis lazuli, and carnelian beads, which were semi-precious beads from the sea, and various types of pottery. Now, the pottery was labor intensive. It took about 3 people 3 days to make large bricks. Okay, so that required some type of a central organization and division of labor. Okay. Now, I mentioned earlier that we'll talk about the dockyard in a place called Lothal, dockyards have been discovered, which dates can be based on carbon tracing, can be traced back to 2500 before the current era. And not only that, these were dockyards, but they were more sophisticated that there was they had some idea about the tides and about filling the docks and allowing the ships to get close to berth infrastructure. And it was made of big brick walls and with some type of a gate system that like what we have in the Panama Canal to maintaining water levels for low tide. And there are remnants of warehouse, which requires a storage system. Okay, along and along with that, so there's the raw materials and the microfossils that have been discovered from, so it was used as a tidal dockyard. Okay, and so this was a major port of trade, which was, between the Middle East and the Indus Valley civilization. And this was the earliest mounds where they were able to discover great baths, which had skipped there. So they had a ritual, a drainage system, along with standard bricks that can be still seen very much in existence. And there were some walls for private baths. Okay, and so this was, so this is that represents a culture that had a sense of personal hygiene and a drainage system a long time ago. Okay, now this is, made with the indigenous bricks. Now this may have significant in religious purification ritual with the tradition is still continued in Hinduism. Taking a bath is a big part of the ritual purification. Okay, and at the same time, various other areas and the wells have been discovered, which I did not put them in the slide for sake of time, but it shows that they had a good storage system for the times when the rain was absent or as, and this shows the big area of granary. Now, these were not rice cultures. They primarily grew barley, millet, and wheat. And there was earliest evidence of cotton weaving as well. So those were some of the main produce of that area. Okay. Now, at the same time, with the paucity of temples or big palaces was surprising to the scholars that this, so perhaps can say that they were more socialistic than you realize. And the houses were relatively modest. There were some were of larger size, but not necessarily this magnificent palaces that have been discovered in the Sumerian, the Assyrian culture. And these were raised on mud brick platforms to protect against the flooding, okay, and along with some type of duct to keep the grain dry, okay, and okay, so that's it. So they had a very sophisticated, organized social structure that summarizes. And this is, as time went along, the skills of craftsmen improved. You can see that they have intricate designs, mostly geometric patterns. And so that required some skill and learning. And this pottery was fire glazed in surface and this was made with wheels with large storage vessels based on a sort of a turntable. So that's the classic pottery technology. The most common style is of red clay with black painted designs, and with, you can just see there are intricate designs. Then the motifs include geometrical patterns, natural elements, the leaves of local trees, as well as animal signs. Okay, and these were used for different purposes, for miniature small vessels and large vessels standing. So pottery was, big trading and use item. And again, here is an example of the ornaments that were used. You can see there are all sorts of beads and shapes and seals and products that were gathered from the sea. And some of the classical structure that should be mentioned before we move on is this was the only statue that was found was a so-called priest king. Okay, let's study that a little bit more. And here's this man with a rather prominent nose, okay, and big thick lips. So it shows his heritage dating back to Africa. He's wearing a rather ceremonial looking robe and has a nice, well-shaped, well crafted beard. So he may be of some figure of authority or perhaps a rich person, okay, who had the ability to afford and pay for all this, okay. And at the same time, one of the other example is that of a little small statue of about 20 inches or so. That is a young girl. You can just see that we can zoom in on her. Again, she has rather prominent lips and has a nice figure and really very scantily dressed, but styling in style, where at the same time her arm is decorated with huge bangles that required some craftsmanship and cost was involved in labor. Okay, and not to be mentioned the central figure, which you can see that it takes a sort of imagination. This is a central figure seated in a squatting position, surrounded by animals. You can see on both sides. The zebu, which was the domesticated animal of that area, the unicorn, the tiger. We can see, and the person is sitting. So this may have been a predecessor of the Hindu uh, god Shiva, or it may be a start of the yogic position. So that it remains to be seen because again we have not been able to decipher their script. Okay, so this we talked about how the ethnicity involved the rich person of some authority, the happy-go-lucky young person, at the same time some type of a religious belief system that had evolved. Okay, and now trade requires, some type of weight. So you can just see they had very precisely measured weights of different scales from large to small. That's like from a couple of pounds to a small, a few grams type of thing. And these weights have been standardized and made precisely to measurement to avoid cheating and confusion. And these weights have been found not only in Arabian Peninsula, but all the way up to Mesopotamia and even in some of the Greek islands. So this, so the trade that shows confirms that the trade was quite extensive in those times. Okay, moving right along, these are the famous seals of Harappan Valley. Unicorn, although that has never been discovered, but it features so largely in their symptoms. More than half of them are unicorn motifs because this was widely spread. And this is the famous zebu. You can just see this is a large predecessor of bull with horns, and again varieties of symbols that were used for a trade exchange. Okay, and varieties of animal motifs, so this may represent either the elites, landowners, merchants. Okay, and again, rhinoceros, elephant uniform, these are all part of their. This is made from a soapstone, a soft type of material, which is carved, fired in a kiln, and hardened. Okay, and there are some other examples of gold and copper as well, but most of them is mud and hardened material, soil type material. Okay. Okay, all right. So let's moving right along. This goes into items, that were traded all across the Middle East. This includes the metals, which include tin, copper, gold, lead, silver, and then again precious stones from Afghanistan. Okay, various other shells, jasper, okay, and high quality carnelian beads, okay, and varieties of other types of stones were also used. Some type of wood was traded as well, okay. So this continued, for civilization had a long record from 2600 before the current era to 1900 BCE, and this was and again, I mentioned varieties of rivers, and here you can see the Gulf of Oman that extends, so that gives them an access to the Middle East. Okay. Now, at the same time, the trade was not just in one direction; that also had some type of trading system, either uh, along the land or by sea, with Southeast Asia as well. Okay, and okay, so now who were these people? This is that it shows some of the skeletons have been discovered, but it's been hard to conclusively obtain large amount of DNA from the skeletons because the DNA does not preserve very well in hot, humid climate of Asia. But some have been discovered, and some isolated DNA analysis have been performed that these people had relationship with the Middle East farmers, and not with the central steppe region, because the Hindu nationalists would love to prove that there is this civilization had relationship with the old Hindus and the Aryan culture, but that has not been the case. David Reich, who is one of the genetics experts at Harvard, has written varieties of scholarly papers as well as popular books about peopling of two subcontinents, i.e., Europe as well as India. And their studies have proved that the genetic evidence arises from migration from Central Asia, steppe region. Okay, the varieties of hunter-gatherers and herding cultures developed in that region that succeeded in conquering or arriving most of the Europe as well as part of the Indo-Iranian plain. Okay, but that's it'll come down a little later on. Okay, so this has some evidence has a mixture of the ancient Iranian DNA as well as South Asian hunter-gatherers. So okay, so this idea about the origin of migrants from north has been disproven conclusively based on a current DNA analysis. The earlier evidence was basically based on the physiognomy or appearance of skeletons as well as linguistic evidence. So that was really relatively harder to rely on 100%. Okay, so the Indus Valley civilization and the Iranian people are arrived from a different group of hunter-gatherers who began farming without being connected. Okay, so it's a lot of mixture. People will travel around, and obviously when they get together, they'll have sex. So it just shows that none of us are quote unquote pure in one way or the other. Okay, so enough philosophy. Now this is just to put on a sidebar. There was also what was happening in Southeast Asia at that time. Again, as we mentioned, the earlier migration was across the frozen land mass or the land bridge that existed between the Sunda and Sahel culture, the relatively small area. That's how the humans were able to migrate all the way to Australia. And these hunter-gatherers had discovered the art of seafaring very quickly. And let me show you here that the migration that took place along the sea trade was dramatic. That from what is modern day Indonesia, they were able to migrate all the way to Madagascar. One would assume that the island of Madagascar, being so close to Africa, would be peopled by the Africans. But there is conclusive evidence based on DNA analysis as well as flora and fauna that the Madagascar culture has roots to Australasian area. So, and one has to admire about the amount of seafaring without any navigational guidelines. So obviously they were well versed in following the sun as well as the star pattern at night. Okay, and varieties of jades and other products have been found in Madagascar. Okay. Okay. Okay, and this is another detailed map of the same, and then not only they traveled the west, but they also traveled, in successive waves to islands which were discovered, Micronesia Island, Polynesia Islands, and finally, now whether they made it all the way to the coast of South Africa, South America or not, that is not been proven. So it is conjecture at this stage. Okay, but you can see that how over a few thousand years, the time frame is well marked around 1200 current era. They were able to populate the Polynesian islands, okay, starting from the archipelago of Indonesia. Okay, now, a word or two about the Indus Valley script. Unlike the Mesopotamia or cuneiform languages that were ably assisted by the discovery of Rosetta Stone in Egypt, which the Brits cleverly transported to the British Museum and had multiple languages that helped decipher the Sumerian script, since it was written Egyptian and Akkadian languages, which the scholars were able to decipher. Unfortunately, that has not been the case with the Indus Valley scripts, and there is a pictographic logo-symbolic language. Okay, and you can see there were a huge number of distinct signs, anywhere between 400 to 700, and the script was written from right to left, and and unfortunately there are no long sentences. It's a brevity, so it's almost like one can say it's like a computer type language for this, or sign language. So that has not been deciphered, and scholars have spent number of years of scholarly pursuit, trying to decipher this to no avail. Okay, and we already talked about the seals, so I'm not going to repeat that. And now this may have roots, that has been conjectured to original natives of India, which is called the Dravidian or South Indian languages, and the languages of the hunter-gatherers, as well as some elements of the Sino-Tibetan languages that is at the border between Burma and i.e. Myanmar and India, and at the same time a type of unknown language. And the South Indian states, have interest in establishing the linguistic links, so that the state called Tamil Nadu in southern India, which is where Madras or Chennai is, the capital, they have offered $1 million prize for anyone who can decipher this, but that has not been claimed yet. Okay, and now what led to before we wind down and move on to other subjects, we'll talk about what was the collapse. That it's finally, just came across this paper recently that in one of the subjournals of Nature magazine. Okay, scientists have said that this was not just one abrupt, like a volcano that happened in Pompeii or Vesuvius. This was a long, slow, evolving process. Century-scale droughts, have reshaped the civilization, and that shows that repeated long dry spells pushed the people towards, abandoning their cities and farming, and eking out a meager living with fishing and with the ocean, and further migration southward took place. So the environmental stresses led with the collapse of the cities and settlements, and spreading out further to south into the more fertile regions of the subcontinent. So this is it's a scary thing as to how a long-standing civilization collapse. Perhaps it's a lesson for our present time. Okay, moving on to the arrival of Aryans. Now, the word Aryan has been maligned since the rise of the Nazi era. Now, but looking at it, the correct culture would be this is the varieties of civilization that started in Central Asia, the so-called Yamanya culture, and there are even other cultures, which can be called Andropo and cultures and Shintasta cultures, which have been discovered by various archaeologists even before DNA became available, based on arrival of skeletons as well as burial sites that were discovered in Central Asia, called Kurgan culture. This has been studied for the last couple of hundred years. Now, with the rise of DNA, a lot of things are being put in proper perspective. That the people from the steppes, the pastoralists, that were natives of the Central Asia, they had successfully tamed horses, and that led to dramatic mobility. So in a span of a few hundred to a couple of 1,000 or so years, they were able to migrate from Central Asia all the way to Europe, as well as one kind ended up in modern-day Iran, as well as in North India. And just the time sequence is very apparent that you can just say it started around 3,300 before the current era, migrated eastward, northward, and southeast area. You can see the varieties of clients that for in about 1,000 years they had made all the way to Europe. Okay, and obviously there is some genetic mixture with the farming area of Middle East, but originally they have essentially replaced in Europe this thing. So they were a force to be reckoned with, and their influence is wide on culture, genetics, everything. So this is, the big thing that David Reich and his groups have established based on a very sophisticated DNA sampling of large number of people from all around the world, not just from Europe, but from Central Asia and Pakistan and southern India. And now, as in India, this has been politicized with the so-called rise of the Aryan civilization and Hindutva culture with the current government. And so, instead of using the word Aryans, they just worked around it by naming it as ancestral North Indian and ancestral South Indians that are separated by not just by DNA analysis as well as by language and appearance. And now just to segue on to Iran and India have different, because the old names can be written as Iran, E-R-A-N, and Bharat, because India is a new word that was coined by the rise of the West. It's the reign of the India Indus River. And the word Indus is a mispronunciation by the Greeks who had difficulty in pronouncing Sindhu, because the original Sanskrit and Indo-European languages have a lot more phonemes. At the same time, English and the European languages is only 26. So due to paucity of phonemes, they were not able to pronounce some of the words S-I-N-D-H-U. The DH is, well, there is only one sign for that in a lot of other languages, which was lacking in modern European languages. Okay, so while the Indian name is based on the two classic epics, which can be compared, with Iliad and Odyssey, the two epics which we'll talk about in just a few minutes, called Mahabharata and Ramayana. Okay, and Maha means great, and Bharat is one of the dynasties of northern India, which ruled around 800 before the current era. Okay, let me just go back to it again. And these are varieties of languages that have evolved from the Indo-Aryan Iranian group, and amongst the Iranian groups that are counted, obviously the Persian is being the big one. Some of the Afghanistan languages called Dari, okay, and the Balochistan, which is the area on the border between Iran and Pakistan, where there is some political crisis right now. Pashto, which is a language of the Afghan people, okay, and also a huge number of Indian Aryan languages, including, Bengali, which is large, Hindi, which is the official language of the Indian Republic, okay, and varieties of other dialects at February. You can see with the large population of India, huge number of people use this language. Okay, all right, let me escape this one. And now sorry, I missed this one. The varieties of similarities that you can see between the original language of Iran called Avesta before the Muslim conquest and rise of Persian. Okay, and these are the language of Zarathustra. I'm sure a lot of you remember, Nietzsche's classic, Thus Spoke Zarathustra. So this was the original monotheistic religion of modern day Iran. And varieties of words, you can see they're quite similar. The word gold between Sanskrit and Avesta, which is their religious language, a word for army, spear, no, Ahura, and Ashura. Okay. Interestingly, Ashuras are considered bad people in the Hindu Aryan culture, while they're considered sacred in the Iranian culture. So how that comes about, that's your guesses. And Hotar means the sacrificing priest. Okay, so this can be a common surname in India as Khota, one who is the sacrificing priest. So a lot of now, obviously, all cultures have their way of getting high, and the sacrificing drink soma, which has nothing to do with alcohol, has been mentioned hundreds of times in the classic Vedic literature, which we'll talk about a little bit. And these people were originally called Aryamans in Arya. So the word is not new, but it's been hijacked by the Germans and the Nazi, who put a racial twist on it, maligning the word for the rest of the word. Okay. Okay. And this is, the Indo-Iranians were part of the expansion that took place, and through varieties of Kurgan culture that I mentioned about. And in India, that established root, and with the tradition of sacrifice of horse and various ritualistic tradition, the rise of the Vedic period that started around 1700 before the current era, and the roots of it are still continuous and constitute the foundation of Hinduism, okay, which is the predominant religion of almost 80% of Hindus. That can be divided in varieties of phases. The early, which involved primarily sacrifice of various animals and and homage to the kings and varieties of gods, including god of thunder, Thor, and and varieties of other gods which have a lot to do with the origin of humans. Okay, the preserver as well as the destroyer. So three types of gods have been proposed: the creator, preserver, and destroyer. And this evolved into more sophisticated philosophy as the times evolved, as to questioning the whole of the thinking process as to the meaning of life, that translated into further scholarly works which were recited and passed along the generation, called Upanishads. Okay, and this again, the earlier worship was to thunder god and fire god, the Agni. Now the horse was extremely important to the herders and pastoralists, so the horse sacrifice figured largely, as I mentioned earlier. And finally, when this was the gradual rise of caste system that has to do with Varna, which is the Brahmins, which was the priest culture, the warriors, the Kshatriyas, and the traders, and the last but not least, the Shudras, or the workers, and they became further classified into degeneration. Now, I've always wondered whether that has to do with the infections, which were a lot more common in the tropics region, that led to the concept of untouchability. Okay, perhaps the early, but that it remains to be proven. And now this is one of the really rather deep thinking of the Vedic philosophy. There was neither existence nor existence then, neither the realm of space nor the sky. So what then, how did the universe start? So that is what this was. One can say that based on modern thinking, that almost parallels our current thinking about the origin of universe, as to what started things, that we are not still sure. And the gods came afterwards. And we created gods in our image, basically. And if he has created it, who knows with the creation of universe? So it just kind of and their time sequence of our numbers that has been proposed in the Vedas is a lot more extensive than that has been proposed in the Bible or Quran, for that matter. That they were able to imagine on larger scales dating back to almost billions of years, and their calculations come eerily close to the modern thinking of 13 billion years. That comes around to 8 billion years. So, and finally, even they question even that even he does not know as to who created. So finally, just they are throwing up our hand as to the how did all this come about. I said that the swastika has been found in Indian cultures and is a big part of the auspicious celebration uh, and worship. And this just represents the four directions, four Vedas, four stages of life, and four goals of life. So that has huge, deep, emotional, spiritual meaning to the Hindu culture. And this is not only that; it's been found all over the world, including in Islamic Spain, as well as some of the South American cultures. Okay. Now it was, and this was adopted or hijacked, literally, one can say, by the Nazi. And the roots may have to do with, the archaeological discovery that took place in the 19th century by various German scholars. And this was discovered along with the discovery of Troy, and the similar artifacts were discovered in Germany. So they tried to separate themselves out and attach the racial significance to it with the blonde, blue-eyed person. And so the word is actually of Indian origin, no doubt. Can be translated in Sanskrit, and so okay, so that has been, and it is still very much apparent in all over the religious temples and in private residences in India. Now, as I said, the Mesopotamian culture was replaced by the Persian. That has to be one of the largest empires that got hold. Persians were people who were the nomadic coming from the steppes area, and they were able to exercise control not just over the whole various warring kingdoms of Mesopotamia, but extended their rule, into modern day Egypt, and later on conquered parts of India. So you can just see this was a widely vast empire, which is very well aware for people who are familiar with Greek history and the great battles that took place at Thermopylae between the Persians and the Greeks. Okay, so this is well known to those who are, had schooling in European history. But the Persian Empire arose and lasted for several hundred years. And even after it came to an end with the rise of Islam. Okay, the cultural influence has continued over not just Iran, but also as part of the big part of Islam, called Shiite cultures, which extends. The majority of Muslims are called Sunnis, and that was the fight that took place after the death of Muhammad the Prophet. Okay, but at least 20% of this are Shiites, and the Mughals who uh, ruled India for several hundred years after the Muslim invasion, were believed followed Shiite faith, and that was a little bit more laid back. And later on, this was the Achaemenid Empire that was around 500 before the current era, before the rise of Islam per se. Okay, and the varieties of names that you're familiar with after reading about Alexander, which we'll got to in just a minute. Okay. Now, interestingly, I just came across this a few days ago, the similarities between Indian and Greek mythology that I just thought might interest some of you. There is the Krishna is well known as one of the avatars of Vishnu, the two big belief systems of Hindu religion, Vishnu and Shiva, the preserver as well as the destroyer. So Krishna is considered one of his avatars, and he's blue-skinned, okay, and there and you can just say that he was big figures bigly, largely in the Mahabharata, the great epic about the fight between the good and evil, aka Star Wars like. Okay, and he was killed by an arrow that pierced his heel. Okay, and the same thing is very much apparent in Achilles. Okay, who was killed by an only vulnerable part of his arrow. Moving on to Indra and Zeus. Indra is considered the god of thunder, okay, and they have weapons called thunderbolt type weapons, as well as they slay a sea monster. And the same thing is done by Zeus, okay, and their opponent is a big serpent, okay. So I can just say that going on to the god of death, Yama, in the Hindu culture, a Hades in the Greek culture, that presides over the underworld, okay, and the shared characteristics, that decide the fate of souls as they pass into the realm, and is deeply concerned with justice. And the same to Cerberus, the three-headed dog that figures largely in both cultures and guard the gates of underworld. Okay, Sita, which one of the wives of one of the kings who figures in the other epic Ramayana, and she was kidnapped, abducted against her will, and by the evil king, you know, Ravana in Ramayana, as well as Persephone by Hades. Okay, and this disappears under the earth under different circumstances. Similarly, Arjuna, the great warrior, and again, figure similar to Achilles, in the Great War, they're reluctant to fight. Achilles was reluctant to fight as well, but they're skilled warriors. They eventually do take part in the war. Okay, and then finally, after they lose their family, they become sad. And so there are varieties of similarities that come across. Okay, I'm sorry that I did not make this the correct color, but the Lord of romance, it's Truths and Arrow, it's Kamadeva, it's the Kama Sutra. I'm sure all of you have heard about, as well as Cupid. Okay, so the similarities are scary, and the big mountain Kailasa, where all the Hindus think that the gods above reside, and the Mount Olympus. Okay, so these mythologies have long, similarities. Now, we talked about Persia, and the Persians had the big empire, and but their method of conquers it was different than King Ashoka, who we'll talk about a little later on. They both were able to conquer large territories, east-west as well as north-south. But the comparison is there is on the mountainside in the center of Iran, a place called Bahistun. Mountain relief was discovered and deciphered by the British explorers, okay, named Sir Henry Rawlinson. He meticulously climbed up and translated this, the mountainside relief that was ordered and carved under the orders of Cyrus of Darius, one of the Persian emperors. Okay, and this was in different languages: Old Persian, Elamite, as well as Akkadian. So they were able to translate it. Now, all this is self-aggrandization. Okay, so it measures about 80 feet by 49 feet, and it praises himself. He's followed by two escorts, okay, and there's the king sitting, on his throne, and the other foreign kings that he had, conquered are coming to pay homage. They're tied with ropes, okay. So I am the king of kings, and so this is a lot of self-praise that comes about. It says I'm the mightiest of all. Now, so that's typical for various emperors, not just, you can was not just Darius, but at the same time, the trend continues with Napoleon or Hitler or whosoever that it may be. Now, at the same time, they were a land-based empire, but at the same time, they had paid some attention to the importance of trade. Now, in the early days, to their credit, the Egyptian had realized that there was a lot of money to be made in the trade with the South Asia and Indian subcontinent. So they had made earlier attempts during the days of the pharaohs in the Middle Kingdom to dig a canal between Niles and the Red Sea, and their efforts were mildly successful, but not completely. And this idea was completed by the Persian kings, in around 500 BCE. And so they were able to the Canal of Pharaohs was completed by the Persians, so giving rise to an alternate route of trading. Okay. Now I said I'll mention something about the languages, and so let's get into that. Now as I mentioned earlier, the Indians were notorious in writing. They just primarily had oral traditions, and obviously the language difficulties were, so there were no record keeping that was done. Now, after the rise of the East India Company in modern-day Calcutta, a philologist or a scholar, or polymath, was appointed as a judge of the Supreme Court of Calcutta. And he was not only prominent in almost all the European languages, but also like with the Middle Eastern languages: Turkish, Arabic, Greek, and so on and so forth, Aramaic. Okay, and when he was transported, obviously, as a judge, he had to deal with the natives. And the two primary communities were Muslims and Hindus, and who spoke different languages: Urdu, which is a mixture of Persian and Hindi, and a local dialect that evolved, writing from right to left, okay, as well as Sanskrit. So he managed to learn very quickly and became proficient in both languages. Now, he kept coming across words, uh, Chandragupta, and at the same time, he was familiar with the classic Greek literature. And the ambassador that Alexander had sent, named Megasthenes, had written a history called Indica, and Sir William Jones was very familiar with Indica, and he was able to find similar words in both languages, albeit not exactly the same, but very similar. Okay, for example, the Megasthenes wrote about the emperor named Sandrocotus, Sandrocottus, while the Indian priests or the Brahmins were very familiar with the dynasty of Mauryan Empire called Chandragupta, Chandra-Gupta. Okay, and at the same time, the big capital that Megasthenes wrote as Palibotra, Palibothra, that they was the same as Patliputra, Liputra, that was in the foothills of Himalaya. So he was able to put time sequence that the two emperors were same and around it. Now they were familiar with when Alexander traveled to India and fought the battle and had to be turned back. So there was around 300 BC before the current era. So the time sequence was established. And he was able to see also the similarities of languages. And that was the start of the philology of the Indo-European languages. And this is just recently, the scholar work persists. A British woman named Laura Spinney had written a book called Proto, How One Ancient Language Conquered the World. Now let's just zoom in on that. It started from somewhere in Central Asia. The timing has been pushed back further, not just to 3000 BCE, but as far back as 7000 BCE. And the people, the pastoralist language travel around slowly over to Europe, gave rise to the Germanic and Baltic languages, as well as other languages, Anatolian, Armenian. It also traveled along the northern routes, to Tocharian, which was one of the early languages of the Kurgan burials, and a part of it traveled along the northern route around 3000 AD to this part of Central Asia, to what are the modern day stands, and later on to the Iranian and Indian subcontinent. Okay, and so this is varieties of migrations that took place of the languages. So this was one of her. This is one of her slides. Okay, and I can just show you that these are some of from the Greek literature. When you're talking about the Greek and Persian wars, these are some of the names that may be familiar to some of you. Okay, Artaxerxes, Cyrus, Darius. Okay, and these are can be written down in old Avastan languages. Okay, Haxamanisha. Okay, obviously I don't know how to write Avastan, but but that can be. This is how it is pronounced, and the Greeks mispronounced it and turned into, from Kurusa turned into Cyrus, and Xyrasa turned into Xerxes, and Daravasu turned into Darius. Okay, and the same thing I can write down in Sanskrit very easily. Okay, Daryavashu. Okay, you can see that how they instead of there are varieties of symbols to pronounce to vowels. Okay, in the Indo-European languages. Okay, and this is the same thing. One of the languages evolved from Sanskrit is called Gujarati, which is the language that I grew up with, and you can just see the similarities. The KU is written by a little umlaut type of thing at the bottom, not at the top. Okay, so the linguistic links are quite apparent even in this simple personal names, and there are many that can be found. And this is the whole linguistic tree that can be translated to Proto-Indo-European languages. It travels into Hellenic Greek, Armenian, Albanian, the Germanic languages, which again branches out into Swedish and Old English, and on the other side it becomes Anatolian, and another branch that segued on further east was the Indo-Aryan languages, and that just again branches out further. You can see as like similar to the evolution of human beings. Okay, I'm sorry, this slide is a little out of sequence, but you can just see that this was the rise of swastika, and here's this Hindu pious person praying at swastika, and the swastika is found all over India and was also apparent in somewhere in Cordoba with the mixture of the Islamic culture. I mean, it's somewhere apparent in this intricate design, because in Islam you cannot paint human face. So various geometric designs, you can just see a swastika right here in the great palaces of Cordoba. Okay, yeah, right here it's apparent. You can just see it. Okay. Okay, and thus spoke Zarathustra, which I mentioned a little while earlier. So this was the Avesta and the Vedic languages. Okay, and Old Iranian. Okay, you can just see how this is the quote from Old Iranian language, you know, and the one path that is that of Asha and not all other paths. So even the religious philosophy is quite apparent between two cultures, the Zoroastrian cultures as well as the Indo-India's Vedic culture. Now, as I mentioned, with the arrival of the Aryans, the two big epics that evolved called Ramayana and Mahabharata. Mahabharata is the fight between the two groups of royals, the good versus the evil type of thing, and that took place in a place in sadly close to Delhi around 800 BC area, and it involved almost varieties of the other kings that came from Central Asia as well as South Asia, and the battle lasted for several days, and eventually the good side won. Okay, that's the story. And Ramayana is a story of another royal fight that takes place with the jealous second stepmother kicks out Rama, who is the avatar of Vishnu, and he goes and fights the evil king in modern day Sri Lanka. So these two epics have a great cultural influence, not just in the subcontinent, but also in South Asia. And let me jump over one. Okay, here's the example of the Ramayana dances in modern day Bali. Okay, and these are still performed in public and with the fight uh, of the monkey god as well as the varieties of dancing that takes place. Okay, and so this is permeated in Cambodia as well as Bali and Java. Okay. And now, with the rigidness of the Brahminic Vedic culture, some of the other thinkers, the self-thinkers, you know, started questioning the doctrine, and this lies to the two great religions. One is Jainism, which more or less remained confined to the subcontinent, and Buddhism, which we'll talk more extensively. And the Jainism is a relatively small but earlier of the two philosophers, the schools that evolved around 7th century BC area, and their principles were relatively very straightforward. They were the first one to propose ahimsa as non-violence, as well as aparigraha, which is asceticism, as well as many-sided reality. And this was again, they did not believe in the concept of a creator, but the good karma was the way to achieve relief from the misery and impermanence of existence. And the big founder of is Mahavira, who is one of the thinkers who was around 500 BC area. And the five big doctrines are ahimsa, truthfulness, non-stealing, and a non-acquisition, and chaste living. So this were the philosophy that most of us can agree with, and the three jewels of various path, right faith, right knowledge, and right action. Now, and this again, it happens many times in religions that divided into Digambara, means those who do not wear any clothes. Obviously, that is permissible only in the Indian climate. And Shvetambara, those who wear white clothing. Okay, and some of these philosophers were even Alexander had encountered with some of these philosophers. And the Jainism was a rather strict, and the non-violence and the discipline was really hard to put up with. And it, did not catch much popularity, but it's confined mostly to the subcontinent. The idea of no possessions have been quietly put aside because the Jains are the biggest financiers and businessmen of the Indian subcontinent, and the big industrial houses, a lot of them are owned by Jains there. So religion can only go so far. And as far as just to segue slightly into Hinduism, the influence of Hinduism and Rama is still very much apparent even in the modern day India, that one of the temples it was destroyed by Muslims in around 1500. The conflict was recorded and it went all the way to Supreme Court, and finally the Hindu mob, just like what happened on January 6th, the mob destroyed the mosque, and finally the Supreme Court of India took their own sweet time and really confirmed that yes, it was the size of the temple, and promptly within a few years, the Hindu-leaning government, so to speak, of Prime Minister Modi constructed the temple, and here he is praying at that site. And of Ramayana. Okay. Now, it's just, sorry, on my side, we're a little out of sync. These are the Jain thinkers, the four jinas. Okay, and these were called gymnosophists. Now, they were carved their teaching in varieties of caves, and they created some of the magnificent temples in central and South India, and obviously so that is still there. That's how the records have been kept and carved on varieties of caves in the hilly part of Central and South Asia. And the other school of thought that evolved was Buddhism, concurrently a couple of hundred years after Jainism. And Buddha his story is well known, but it can be summarized. he was one of the princes of a small kingdom which was arose in the foothills of Himalaya. Okay, and he was kept in luxury. And finally, one day he was able to travel outside his comforts of palace, where he saw an old person, a sick person, and a dead person. Okay, and that's when he realized as to how life is impermanence, and decided to follow initially the Mahaviran thinking, but complete abandoning and starving himself to seek enlightenment. That unfortunately did not work out, and finally, he decided to seek something called the middle pathway. And after several years of meditation, you know, he discovered enlightenment and varieties of thinking when he was able to preach the centrality of the taking the best elements of both religions, the Vedic culture, as well as his own, things about the impermanence of life and the need for good deeds, good path. And this is can be summarized in the four basic truths. Buddhism has become widely popular in the West, and now the four noble truths. Our life is inevitable and short, and there is a cause for suffering, and to end the suffering is considered eightfold pathway, and which, again, just like in Jainism, we can all agree easily: right mindfulness, right view, right intention, concentration, speech, effort, livelihood. So that is certainly very acceptable, to most rational human beings. Okay. And again, this just talks about the spread of Buddhism, but there's an interesting story to be told about how it came about. It started in a small region of northeast India, okay, and managed to spread by land to modern day Afghanistan and Bactria, okay, as well as to South India, to Sri Lanka, and as well as, and again by sea to Southeast Asia in a few hundred years, okay. And that's an interesting story that needs to be told as to how that goes about. And obviously, it has a huge leg with the support of the royalty, the King Ashoka that we mentioned. So, okay. Now, at the same time, before we go into the how Buddhism spread, from the West, the great Alexander traveled by land and managed to conquer not just smaller kingdoms, but the great Persian Empire. And around in a span of about 10 or so years, he was on the border of India, okay, traveling from Greece, from Macedonia, conquering Mesopotamia and other areas. Okay, and when he came to India, he ran into one of the Indian kings called Porus, and he fought on the battle, the river battle, on in one of the seven rivers of modern day Pakistan, or Indus area. And he was able to out. This is the first time the Greek army encountered elephants during monsoon season, but luckily they were to outsmart by getting behind the swimming by crossing the rivers somewhat upstream, and the Greek phalanx was able to shower the elephants with arrows, causing the elephants to be wounded and turn on their own army. And Alexander was able to win the war, but his soldiers had enough of it. And finally, he decided to abandon the further attempts to conquer. Now, he had a very limited notion as to what is actually beyond this, that he thought he was reaching the end of the world as, okay, and did send explorers to the Arabian Sea, which we'll talk about in just a minute. Now, and so this was, and his contemporary was you know, were the smaller Indian kingdoms. India was ruled by varieties of small states, and one of the soldiers' name was Chandragupta, but was the who went on and somewhat inspired by Alexander's conquest, established the Mauryan kingdom, which again controlled the whole of subcontinent, in few years. Now, the influence of Buddha is all over, and this is one of the recent findings that I just thought might interest some of you. That we all know that the Buddhism spread east and south to Sri Lanka, but at the same time, recently, Buddhist statues have been discovered as far as in Baranika, which is one of the ports in Egypt. Okay, and the part of it has also been found in one of the Isis temples, Horus temple. So, and this was donated by perhaps a rich merchant, and it also covered. And along with this, they also discovered a jar which contained about 17 pounds of black peppercorns. So this was in the court of the Berenike temple. Berenike was a seaport, on the Red Sea, which was used by the Egyptian pharaohs. Okay, and as the ships traveled from India via the Red Sea, and so that was in along with Hormuz, there were two big ports on the Red Sea that were instrumental in trade between Egypt and India. Okay, and this was again, some of these descriptions have been in Sanskrit language, and it can be dated back to the time of the Roman Emperor Philip the Arab, who ruled Rome around 244 to 249 BC. And at the same time, there were some Indian coins have been discovered, which can be dated to second century current era. Okay, and varieties of inscriptions have been found, including in Greek and in Sanskrit language, clearly establishing the link between the three areas: the Mediterranean, Egypt, as well as India. Okay, and this have been the French scholars have discovered varieties of scripts in South Indian language, Tamil, Sanskrit, and Prakrit. The varieties of names have been discovered on the walls of the tombs of pharaohs. Okay, and uh, so, and this can be dated back to first and third century current era. And some name in Koran has surfaced before, which has been inscribed on pottery shards. Okay, and this was one of the sailors, and the word is still clearly of Tamil origin. Okay, and now, along with that, the people love that human beings love to tell stories, and varieties of stories were discovered in Hinduism culture, Panchatantra, which are the various animal fables, you can see, which have been written down later on in, other Indian languages. Okay, and this are like the moral stories written for children, which are the lion and the hare, the mongoose and the snake, or the dreaming milkmaid. Okay, and these have gradually traveled across to Persia, where they're called Kalila and Demna, and then later on in Syriac century, and later on they traveled to Europe and have segued later on into what is known as Aesop's fables. Okay, okay, so the stories have continued and have been part of human culture. Now, as I mentioned earlier, Alexander celebrated his success with the Indian Empire by here he is vanquishing an elephant and just by the silver coin. Okay, and here he's blessed by a thunder. Okay, these are the images survived from his lifetime. He's engaging, and this with the garland of laurels. So these are the coins that are at in the British Museum. Okay, and at the same time, the Greek historians have written books. Strabos wrote a book on geography, okay, about the Arabian Sea, okay, and the Satron, another historian named Ahrens wrote a book called Indica. So this has been well documented. And as I mentioned earlier, some of the Jain philosophers traveled with Alexander to the Mediterranean, and in that, so there was some cultural exchange that took place between the subcontinent and Greek, whether various thoughts were transmitted which way, right direction, that is a Greek to be conjecture. Okay, so and now Alexander, after he returned, he appointed various satraps or soldiers. One of them was Seleucid, and the other side were Ptolemies and other ones in Middle East as well. So, okay, and the one that needs to be mentioned is, is Seleucid, which was the kingdom that was around 200 BC to 100 in what is known as modern day Afghanistan and part of the Stan. So he established a city called Alexandria, and that was the Indo-Greek kingdom, which lasted for only a few years and was defeated by the Mauryan Empire, which started from the foothills of Himalayas. Okay, but so, and this is the region of Gandhara, and this figures largely in the spread of Buddhism by land route from India along the passes to Central Asia and later on to China. And at the same time, there was a rise of the great school of learning called Taxashila, which started, and this was considered the great, you know, enlightened period of the Vedic culture, so called the Golden Era, where the great epics and the plays were written and celebrated, and then the Greeks were well aware of it at this time. Okay, so and before we wind down, I'll just mention that this is still relevant in that in that area, Buddhist sculptures in the northern Pakistan and Afghanistan have been discovered in a place called Mes Ayanak. The name is not important, but this is very near Kabul, in various Buddhist stupas, which are these big mounds or as temples and residence of monks are are found, and you can see the statues of a Buddha with a mix of physiognomy is apparent. And at the same time, this is a region of copper mines, and this was discovered by the Russians in 1970s. Now, and obviously, the Chinese have obtained a contract with the Taliban as to how this will go with preservation of this Buddhist city is remains to be seen. Okay, I think we have come up to a fairly good point, and we should stop at this stage, and we'll continue next time about the various caves which celebrates Hinduism and Buddhism in subcontinent, and the marvels of architecture and mountain carving. We'll stop here. Have a